Hello, this is Dr. K. In this video, we're going to go through a very brief history of mobile platforms. When I say mobile platforms, I mean the operating systems for mobile devices. Things like Android, iOS, Windows, and BlackBerry. Keep in mind that I'm making this video in the summer of 2017. So when I talk about the state of mobile platforms today, what am I talking about? Well, I'm actually talking about the end of 2016 because that's what we actually have data for right now. I'm going to begin this presentation by asking you a few questions. Before I do, go ahead and take a minute to get a pencil and a piece of paper or just open up a text editor so that you can save your answers to these questions somewhere. I'll give you 5 seconds to pause the video and do that. 5 seconds starting now. Okay, we just have 5 questions, and you can feel free to pause the video at the end of each question so that you can jot down your answer. But there's no need to search for the answer online because we're going to come back to these questions at the end of the presentation, and we're going to go over the answers then. And of course, all the answers are in the presentation itself. Let's get started. The first question: what operating system dominated the smartphone market in 2009? And to give a little context for this question, remember that the iPhone was announced at the beginning of 2007. And let me just note here, if you have never seen Steve Jobs' keynote where he introduces the iPhone, I strongly encourage you to watch it. It's a masterpiece of communication and marketing, and it really helps that the device itself really was revolutionary. It's kind of amazing that 10 years later, that vision of the smartphone is still largely unchanged. Okay, back to the question. What operating system dominated the smartphone market in 2009, just 2 years after the introduction of the iPhone? Was it Android, which was also announced in 2007, though it was not on any devices yet? BlackBerry, which certainly dominated the US market before the iPhone came along? Was it the iPhone's operating system? Or was it the Symbian operating system, which was used on Nokia smartphones and some other brands? And remember, these are global data. Okay, jot down your answer and let's go on to the second question. How many major smartphone platforms are there today? And when I say major, I mean platforms that have at least 1% of the market. Now, you should all know of 2 platforms that have a significant market share, namely Apple's iOS and Google's Android. But are they the only 2 that have a larger than 1% market share? If so, then 2 is your answer. But is there another one? Perhaps Windows or BlackBerry? So maybe it's 3 or 4, or maybe it's more than 4. I'm talking about global markets here, which includes Russia, China, and India. Okay, next question. How many smartphones are sold for every laptop sold? Obviously, there are more smartphones sold than laptops, but how many more? Is it a 5-to-1 ratio, a 10-to-1 ratio, or perhaps a 15-to-1 ratio? Or maybe there are 20 times as many smartphones being sold as there are laptops. What do you think? Okay, next question. Which app store actually brings in more revenue? Is it Apple's iOS App Store, or is it Google Play? Or do they both bring in roughly the same amount of revenue? All right, last question. How many Android users are actually using the latest version of Android? Is it 10%? That's not very much. Maybe it's 25%. That's a little better. Perhaps 50% of Android users are using the latest version of Android. Or maybe it's 90%, almost all of them. What do you think? Okay, enough questions. Save your answers if you haven't already, and let's go through the rest of the presentation. We'll start with a timeline of smartphones and their operating systems. Not everything is going to be on this timeline, but I've tried to pick out events that I think are important. In 1998, Symbian was created. It was a joint venture between Nokia, Ericsson, and Motorola. And it was an operating system that was primarily used on PDAs, or personal digital assistants. In 1999, the first version of BlackBerry's operating system came out. One of its uses was on a pager. The operating system allowed that pager to send emails and text messages. In 2001, Symbian OS 6 was released. It was used on a device called the Nokia Communicator. It was basically a glorified PDA, but interestingly, unlike some other PDAs, the Communicator did not have a touchscreen. The Symbian OS did not support it, and some people think that this is something that actually handicapped them when touchscreens became popular again with the introduction of the iPhone. In 2002, the first BlackBerry phone was released. It looked like a PDA, and you had to attach an earphone to the device to use the phone feature. Also in 2002, the first phone running Symbian OS came out. This one actually did look and work like a mobile phone. It had a number pad that you could slide out when you needed it. But to send text messages, you had to use the number keys and tap multiple times if you wanted certain letters. In 2003, Android Incorporated was founded by Andy Rubin, who was a former Apple engineer and the founder of a company that made a phone for T-Mobile called the Sidekick. Android was intended to be an operating system for mobile devices, including cameras and possibly phones also. In the years from 2004 to 2006, BlackBerry and Nokia, with its Symbian OS, dominated the smartphone market. These were the years when you could hear people using the term crackberry, referring to the addictive nature of Blackberries. Many people who own them seem to use them all the time for texting and emails. But one little item of note here is that in 2005, Google acquired Android. The period between 2004 and 2005 is also when Apple began seriously working on the iPhone. And that brings us to the release of the iPhone in 2007. Probably the most important event on the timeline of mobile computing. Again, if you watch the keynote for this event, it's striking how similar smartphones of today are to the original iPhone. In the same year, Google announced the development of the Android operating system, and they emphasized that they would be giving the operating system away for free, and that other companies could use it and or modify it as they saw fit. So this was a big incentive for a lot of companies to migrate to Android. 2007 was also the year that Amazon released the first Kindle. So 2007 was an important year for mobile devices. In 2008, the iPhone added the App Store to the iPhone. Now developers had a way to create their own custom applications and sell them to iPhone users. The first Android phone was released in 2008. Though it was nothing like the iPhone. In fact, it looked like the BlackBerry and Nokia smartphones that Steve Jobs disparaged in his iPhone keynote. In 2008, Microsoft switched from an operating system they called Windows Mobile to one they called Windows Phone, in hopes that they could break into this expanding market. And in 2009, several new operating systems were released. Palm's WebOS, Nokia's MeGo, and Samsung's Bata. Everyone wanted a piece of what they saw was going to be a huge market. But most companies knew that once the dust settled, there were only going to be a handful of operating systems left. Between 2009 and 2010, Motorola, Samsung, LG, and Sony all announced that they would no longer make Symbian phones. Most moved to Android, though some did move to Windows Phone. Now, this is a good time to stop and consider what the smartphone platform landscape looked like in 2009. As you can see from this chart, Symbian and BlackBerry still dominated the market, but Apple's iPhone, which had only been released 2 years before, had already nearly caught up to BlackBerry in terms of market share. People knew that the iPhone was the future, but they still needed a non-Apple operating system that would get them there. Despite the fact that Android only had 3% market share to this point, it seemed like the best hope for getting there. So, at this point in time, even though Symbian and BlackBerry have a huge percentage of the market, their technology is considered old technology, and their market share was already beginning to shrink. So let's see what happens next. 2010 was another important year for mobile devices. Apple launches the iPad, a 10-inch tablet that runs the same operating system as the iPhone. But perhaps the news that is just as important is that HTC comes out with the first Android phones that have full touchscreen interaction. And we know this is a big deal because Steve Jobs meets with Eric Schmidt of Google and threatens to sue him. Ultimately, Apple decides to sue HTC instead. At this point, Nokia has already sued Apple, and Apple has already brought a countersuit against Nokia. Eventually, Microsoft will sue Motorola, Apple will sue Samsung, Motorola will sue Apple, and Oracle will sue Google. But that's a whole different kind of history. Near the end of 2010, Samsung releases the Galaxy Tab, a 7-inch tablet running Android. And it turns out that in the last quarter of 2010, smartphones actually outsell PCs worldwide. As an indication of where the future of the smartphone platform is going, it's interesting to note that Apple starts 2011 as the biggest smartphone vendor, and Samsung ends 2011 as the largest smartphone vendor. And by the end of 2011, Android is already the operating system on more than 50% of the smartphones sold. In 2012, Nokia says it will use Windows on its phones. And indeed, in 2013, Windows Phone passes BlackBerry as the third most popular platform after Android and iOS. But what does this actually mean? It means that Windows has 4% of the market to BlackBerry's 3% of the market, while Android and iOS have over 90% of the market. So, yes, it's a victory, but the dust is beginning to settle. Let's keep moving. Microsoft buys Nokia in 2014, but it doesn't help. In 2015, Apple announces Apple Watch. In 2016, BlackBerry says it will stop making its own phones. Google introduces Android Wear 2.0, the first version of that OS that can reasonably compete with Apple Watch. And at the end of 2016, this is where we stand. Android has about 85% of the market, iOS has about 15% of the market, and all other smartphone operating systems put together have less than 1%.